Hi, everybody. My name is Sukwon. I'm an economics teacher here at ElitePrep, and today I'll be showing you how to solve a problem from the AP Macroeconomics exam. So let's get started. So as you can see from the table here, we're going to be dealing with some economic aggregates. And the key to solving problems like this is knowing where to focus on, right? Because immediately you're, given a whole bunch of numbers here, and we're not really sure what to focus on. But for each part of each problem, you don't really need to take a look at every single number or figure on the table, right, to solve it, right? So the key to this problem is knowing what to focus on and knowing what to ignore. Let's take a look at part A. We read, using the data in the table, calculate each of the following and show your work. So we're being asked to calculate Tehran's real GDP in 2012 and the inflation rate in Tehran from 2011 to 2012, right? And here, it's actually going to be easier to solve part two first. That is, it's going to be easier to calculate the inflation rate before we actually calculate Tehran's real GDP in 2012. So, how do we calculate the inflation rate? Well, we're going to need to take a look at something called the GDP deflator. What is the GDP deflator? It's essentially a price index, and as such, I'll be abbreviating CPI, Consumer Price Index, which is a type of price index, of course, that we use. And all that means is it's a representation, it's a sort of average of prices normalized to a specific year. That year, of course, it can be any year, but in this problem, it's going to be 2011, where GDP deflator, or the price index, is at 100, and in 2012, we see that the GDP deflator is 125, right? So we see prices have changed. The other column we're going to be taking a look at to solve this problem is going to be the very first one, the nominal GDP problem, right? So really, for part A, all you have to do is take a look at this first column and this last column. Now, in order to find the inflation rate, all you have to do is follow quite a simple formula. So the inflation rate equals the CPI, the price index, or the GDP deflator in year two, right? The year that we want to find the inflation rate for, minus CPI, the price index, in year one, and then divide that by the CPI price index in our first year, right? And then multiply that by 100 to get 8%. Right. So let's go ahead and plug in our numbers to find the inflation rate between 2011 and 2012. So price index, the GDP deflator in year two was 125. Price index in year one here is it's going to be 100. Divide that again by 100, the price index in year one, and then multiply that by 100, right? Which should give us an inflation rate of 25%. Oof. We see that between 2011 and 2012, for this country of Tehran, prices rose by 25%, quite a bit, right? So we know that the answer for part two is 25%. And that's the work that we need to show there. To calculate the real GDP, we're going to do something quite similar, right? Except apply our inflation rate to nominal GDP in 2012, right? And in order to get real GDP for a second year, for year two, all we have to do is take the nominal GDP in that year, right? And then multiply it by the price index, CPI, in year one, divided by the CPI, the price index, or the GDP deflator, in year two, the year that we're concerned about, right? Plugging in the numbers, this comes out to be $225,000 times 100 over 1, right? We plug this into our calculator, we get 225,000 times 0.8, which comes out to be, of course, $180,000. And that's going to be our answer for part one. Part B. Tehran is the only producer and exporter of electric vehicles. Assume the price level among Tehran's trading partners remains the same, and the inflation rate calculated in Part A2 is reflective of price changes for electric vehicles. As a result of the change in the relative price level, would foreign importers buy more or fewer electric vehicles from Tehran in 2012 compared to 2011? Explain. So here we just kind of need to understand what inflation is, right? We calculated, of course, in part A that the inflation rate was positive, it was 25%. That is, prices in Tehran rose 25% from year 2011 to year 2012, right? Whereas in other countries, right, the countries that Tehran trades with, prices didn't rise, right? That is, the price level among Tehran's trading partners remained the same, right? So when you're looking at this problem, you might be tempted to consider a lot of things: exchange rates, right? The relative wealth, consuming power of these other trading partners, right? If their GDP rose or not. But you don't have to, right? Because remember, this question is asking you to find the um, relative change in, or rather the change in the number of electric vehicles sold as a result of the change in the relative price level. Nothing else is being considered here, so we can assume ceteris paribus. That is, all else equal. So, there are three things that you need to consider here. But before all that, you need to know that higher inflation means, or positive inflation means higher prices, right? So positive inflation, higher prices. So there are three things you essentially need to say here to get the full point for part B. One, electric vehicles are relatively more expensive. Due to what? Due to positive inflation, right? That is a positive change in the price level, right? Next, the law of demand states higher prices, lower quantity demanded, right? Finally, right, we can put these two parts together and say, therefore, foreign importers will buy fewer electric vehicles from Tehran. Why? Because the relative price of electric vehicles has gone up. Because Tehran's price level has gone up, whereas the price level of the trading partners of Tehran have not changed, right? So it's relatively more expensive. They'll buy fewer of them. Excellent. Let's go ahead and move on to part C. C reads, did the standard of living of the average person in Tehran increase, that is go up, decrease, go down, or stay the same between 2011 and 2012? Explain. Now, when you see this, phrase standard of living, you might be tempted to think of a lot of things, right? Standard of living is how nice a person lives. And, a lot of these columns on this table are going to be tempting, right? Like tax revenues, obviously, if you're being taxed more, you're probably not too happy. Government outlays, if the government's spending more, maybe, standard of living is going up. Consumption spending, does how much, consumers in Tehran spend, does that relate to standard of living? Maybe you might think, right? No. You have to know that for the AP macro exam, standard of living means something very specific. And that's just going to be the real GDP per capita, right? And all that is just the real GDP for a certain year divided by population in that year, right? What is real GDP? Remember, real GDP is going to be the value of all goods and services produced in an economy in a certain year, adjusted for inflation, right? Do we know the real GDP for both years? Yes. In 2012, we found that the real GDP from Part A was 180,000, right? Adjusted for inflation. And do we know the real GDP for 2011? Also, yes, right? Because remember, since we're adjusting it to 2011 dollars, the real GDP and the nominal GDP for 2011 are the same. That is at $150,000. So all we need to do in order to determine if the standard of living has gone up, gone down, or stayed the same is calculate real GDP per capita for each year. So let's go ahead and do that for 2011. That's, of course, just going to be real GDP per capita in 2011, which is $150,000, divided by population, 100. And that's going to get us, of course, $1,500, right? Not terribly rich, right? For reference, most developed Western economies have a GDP per capita of around, $30,000 and up, right? So Tehran's not doing so well, but let's see if they are doing any better in 2012. In 2012, their real GDP was $180,000. Let's divide that by the population. Ooh, their population increased to 120. Maybe births, maybe immigration, we don't know, right? But we do the division here and we see, oh, actually, real GDP in 2012 was also $1,500, right? So real GDP per capita did not change. So all you need to do to get full points here in part C is say real GDP per capita did not change. So the standard of living remained the same. And of course, showing the work of how to calculate a real GDP per capita is necessary too. So that's going to answer part C here. Moving on to part D. Last one here. What effect will the changes in Iran's government budget between 2011 and 2012 have on Iran's national debt? Right. A few things we need to sort of define here before we solve this problem. That's going to be government budget and national debt. Right. Governments and households, right? Just us normal people are quite different, right? In the sense that you can't quite compare government budgets to household budgets, right? But there are some similarities, right? Governments take in money, like we take in money through jobs and other ways of getting money, and governments spend money, right? Much like we spend money on food, books, transportation, whatever, right? And so, if governments take in more revenue via taxes or whatever, right? Then it spends and outlays welfare spending, military spending, infrastructure spending. That means the government has a budget surplus. Excuse me, budget surplus, right? And that's when tax revenues or other revenues is greater than government outlays. That is, any government spending. It can also be the case, of course, right, that governments spend more, right, in outlays than they take in. Ooh, fiscally irresponsible, right? And we call that situation a budget deficit. A budget deficit. And that's when tax revenues or other revenues are less than government outlays or government spending. Whoops, outlays. Right? What happens in each of these scenarios? Well, when we have a budget surplus, that means the government has extra money left over after spending, and it can use that money to do, well, really anything, right? It can keep it in its bank account, or if it has a national debt, it can use that money to pay down the national debt, right? So any years where we have a budget surplus usually mean the national debt is going down, right? Because that surplus is being used to pay off the debt. Quite the opposite in the case of a budget deficit. Right? A budget deficit means that at the end of the year, right, the government doesn't have enough money to, pay all its commitments, right, to fund all of its outlays, right? And in order to fund all of its outlays, right, what it needs to do is it needs to borrow money, right? And it can do that in a number of ways, which you should have learned in your macro class, right? But if it does need to borrow money, of course, it means that the national debt is going to go up, right? So surpluses make the national debt go down, and budget deficits make national debt go up, right? Of course, we can also have the case that we have a balanced budget. And that's the case, of course, where tax revenues equal government outlays, right? And that's going to leave us with a grand total of nothing left over, but nothing that we need to borrow, and as such, that's going to make no impact on the national debt. So let's see what is the budgetary situation for Iran in 2011 and the budgetary situation for Iran in 2012. Right? So for 2011, it took in $25,000 worth of tax revenues, right? And it spent $25,000 in government outlays. In order to find the relative deficit or the surplus, what we need to do is we need to take the revenues and subtract government outlays from it, right? So let's subtract these two, right? Subtract the outlays from the revenues, and we get a grand total of $0, right? So we see that in 2011, Iran had a balanced budget. That is, it wasn't adding to its debt, but it wasn't paying down its debt either, right? No impact on the debt. So let's see what happens in 2012. Tax revenues in 2012 were $30,000, and outlays in 2012 were $35,000, right? Just to recap, we're looking at these two columns here. Ooh, that gives us negative $5,000. Iran is $5,000 in the hole for 2012, right? And so it has a deficit of $5,000. Now, exactly like we talked about earlier, this means that in fiscal year 2012, Iran's going to need to borrow $5,000 from the central bank or elsewhere, right, in order to fund all of its government outlays, right? And as such, the change in the budget, right, going from a balanced budget to a $5,000 deficit means that it's going to need to borrow $5,000, which means that Farhan's national debt will go up. By how much? $5,000, right? So our answer here is going to be, as Farhan's budget goes from being balanced to a $5,000 deficit, it will need to borrow money, and the national debt will increase. And that's going to be our solution to part D. So that's going to be the answers here for problem number 2. See you next time.